We continue our study of voice leading root position triads by looking at root motion by third and sixth. Below we see two examples of root motion by third and sixth. As I mentioned, for now we'll continue working with root position triads, which mean the progression of the bass voice will already be defined in advance. We're already working with root position triads, so we know if we're moving from 1 to 6, we're moving from a C to an A if we're in C major. And if we move from 1 to 3, down a sixth here, we'd be moving from C to E in C major. So if we're working with root position triads, the bass voice is already taken care of. For the other voices, we'll try to find the smoothest motion possible, just like we did in working with root motion by fourth and fifth. Root progressions by third and sixth work best, like many of these progressions, if the root is doubled in both chords. This will allow us to keep a common tone, and not just a common tone, but two common tones between the chords. So keeping a common tone in two voices. Here we see the common tones of E and C between the C major chord and the A minor chord. The remaining voice will just simply move by step to the nearest chord member. This same process works if we move down a sixth, since we're just moving in reverse. So common tones are kept there, and we move down by step between the C and the B. This is the simplest motion, and if we can double the root, then that will work best. A few special cases to run into, just as we ran into with root motion by fourth and fifth in the minor mode, we have to look out for augmented seconds, and we have to continue to be both alert and flexible, and perhaps change our strategy. With regards to root motion by third, we will encounter this issue most when moving from 2 diminished to 7 diminished in the minor mode. Here we see the first example, which is smooth. It keeps the common tone, moves the other voice by step, and the bass voice moves down by a third. However, this example has an augmented second, an A flat to B natural in the tenor voice. So it's less idiomatic and should be avoided. The second example doubles the third of the 7 diminished. Here we have this D. We have both the soprano stem going up, the alto stem going down, so we know that pitch is doubled. And that's okay to do on a diminished chord because it de-emphasizes the tritone. Here's the B natural to F, that diminished fifth, the tritone. And by doubling the third, we soften the chord just a little bit, and that's absolutely fine. We should note that the tenor and bass have parallel tritones. It's not actually a voice leading error, and one of them is also sort of hidden in a middle voice. So it's not great, but it's certainly better than an augmented second, which will feel quite strange. So there we see the doubled third, absolutely okay, and we see the parallel tritones, not superb, but absolutely fine in this style. In this last example, we see a doubled third both in the 2 diminished and in the 7 diminished. Here we have 2 Fs, and here we have 2 Ds. It avoids the parallel tritones. It does have an augmented interval between the alto, between the alto's motion, the A flat up to D, an augmented fourth. Remember, we want to try to avoid those augmented intervals. That's how we got into this problem in the first place with this augmented second. I will say that you will occasionally see augmented fourths and some other augmented intervals creep in. What makes this augmented second really stand out is that there is an altered tone. That A flat up to B natural, up to that leading tone, really stands out. And this A flat up to D natural, there's no altered tone in there. Everything is diatonic within the key. So it's a little bit more acceptable. It's also hidden in an inner voice. I know this one was also hidden in an inner voice, this augmented second, but we're really trying to avoid those augmented seconds. If an occasional augmented fourth creeps in there, we know that Bach has done that too, but it's probably a little bit less desirable, though hidden in an inner voice in this case. Doubling the root works best for root motion by third. When the fifth is doubled, it can lead to some potential voice leading issues. In these situations, moving all notes by the smallest value can lead to non-idiomatic voice leadings. And so more leapy solutions may need to be found, where we have more disjunct rather than conjunct motion. In this first example from 1 to 6, everything's moving smoothly, however we end up with parallel octaves. Similarly, if we try to fix that by having the G go down to an E, we'll actually run into some parallel fifths. So we can't go up to the root of the chord, we can't go down to the fifth of the chord. Well, perhaps we can change things around and leap up to the third of the chord. And yes, actually this does work. It looks a little bit, as I say, more leapy, more disjunct, but this actually will be just fine. We have no parallel issues in this case. And the leap up to a C forms an imperfect consonance with the bass. It will sound nice and rich, and there's no fear of any sort of parallelisms happening there. Similarly, if we descend by sixth, we see some of these issues. Here, everything looks okay. We've got some contrary motion, but actually in that contrary motion is hidden the issue. We actually have consecutive fifths. The C up to a G moves to an E and a B. So we have those consecutive fifths by contrary motion this time. In this next example, we end up with a direct octave, G leaping down to an E. So what's left is to find some other solutions where we have this tenor voice leaping downwards. Again, it's more disjunct, but if we're not going to double the root, we might end up with these situations of having disjunct voices. Lastly, looking at a tripled root. When tripling the root of a chord and then moving by third or sixth, some solutions may need to be utilized that use more leaps as well. However, care still needs to be taken to avoid voice-leading pitfalls. Here's our first example. We have a tripled root in our one chord, and a doubled fifth in our second chord, and that actually works out just fine. There are no parallel issues. We do have a leap here in the tenor voice, but there's no problem there. Here we move to a tripled root and a doubled root, so as we would normally see it, and everything's fine here. We do have octaves between the bass and soprano, but they're moving from an imperfect consonant, a C to an E to an A to an A. There's no problem with that. We can certainly have octaves in outer voices, we just have to be careful of how we approach them. If this had been in similar motion, the E leaping down to the A, then we would have had an issue. Here, even though there's a lot of leapiness going on, everything is also okay. C leaping up to a G makes sure that we've got the third of the chord, and this leap doesn't create any sort of perfect interval issues. However, in this last example, we end up having consecutive octaves by contrary motion when we leap from a C and a C in the bass and the tenor to an E and an E in the bass and the tenor. So there are different possibilities, and we will end up leaping a little bit more if we don't double the root in root motion by third and sixth. There are solutions to it, but we still need to be on the lookout for any of these voice leading pitfalls for this style.